It was early morning and the sun was just rising over the hills, and Ray was sitting in his kitchen drinking warm tea and watching the birds fly outside. His window and everything felt calm and quiet and peaceful, just like every other day, until he heard a soft thump from the backyard, and he stood up slowly, wondering if something had fallen. And as he opened the back door, he felt a strange chill in the air and saw nothing at first, and then he looked closer and his eyes widened. There was a woman lying in the grass right near his garden, and she looked like she had fainted, and her clothes were dirty and torn, and her arms were wrapped tightly around a small baby. And Ray rushed forward without thinking and dropped to his knees beside her, and he touched her shoulder gently and asked if she was okay. And she slowly opened her eyes and her lips moved, and she whispered something so soft that Ray had to lean in closer to hear her. "Please don't let them take her," she said before her eyes rolled back and she went unconscious again. And Ray stared at her, confused and scared, and he looked down at the baby, who was sleeping quietly in her arms. And he had never seen a baby like this before, because the child had a strange calm glow around her, and her face looked human, but there was something different about her eyes. Even though they were closed, Ray did not know what was going on, but he knew he could not leave them outside. So he picked up the woman carefully and carried her inside his house and placed her gently on the couch. And then he picked up the baby and wrapped her in a warm blanket and placed her in a basket near the fireplace. And he checked the woman for injuries, but saw none except a few small cuts and bruises, and he wondered if they had been in an accident or were running from someone. As the hours passed, the woman did not wake up, and Ray sat near the baby, who still had that strange calm glow, and he felt something deep inside him, like a soft pull or a strange connection he could not explain. And he reached out and touched the baby's hand, and it felt warm and peaceful. But the moment he touched her, a light flickered in the room, and the radio turned on by itself, and the TV screen flashed, and Ray jumped back in shock. He stared at the baby and then at the radio, and then he turned everything off and tried to stay calm, but deep down he knew this was not normal. And he looked at the baby again and thought about what the woman had whispered. "Please don't let them take her." And Ray whispered back, "Who are they, and why would they want a baby later?" That night, when the woman was still unconscious, Ray decided to look into her small backpack that had been lying in the grass. And he felt guilty, but he needed answers, and inside he found a blanket and some food and a photo. And when he picked up the photo, his hand stopped moving, because it showed the woman holding the baby with a man he did not recognize, and behind them was something that looked like a giant machine, and on the edge of the photo were some strange letters that looked like no language he had ever seen. The letters glowed faintly in the dark, and Ray felt cold all over, and he knew now that this was something bigger than he could understand. And he walked back to the living room and sat down beside the baby again, and she opened her eyes slowly for the first time, and Ray froze. Her eyes were glowing softly like stars in the night sky, and they looked straight into his soul. And in that moment, he felt like she was speaking to him, not with words, but with something else, something deeper. And he knew without doubt that this child was not normal, and maybe not even fully human. And yet, she felt safe and warm and innocent. Ray sat back and covered his face with his hands and whispered, "What have I gotten myself into?" And just then a noise came from outside, and it sounded like a low hum, like something flying slowly above the house. And the windows began to shake gently, and Ray ran to the window and looked up, but saw nothing. And yet the sound was still there, and his heart began to race. And he looked back at the baby, and then at the door. Something was coming, and it was looking for her. Ray could not sleep that night, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the baby's glowing eyes and heard the woman's whisper again and again and again. And something deep inside him said this was not just a lost mother and child in trouble. This was something far bigger, something not from here, something not from Earth. The woman finally woke up just after sunrise, and Ray was sitting on the chair next to her, and she opened her eyes slowly and looked around with panic and confusion. And then she saw the baby safe and warm near the fireplace, and a tear rolled down her face, and she sat up quickly holding her side like she was in pain, and Ray raised his hands and said, "It's okay, you're safe," and she looked at him for a long time before she spoke in a soft, broken voice. "Who are you?" she asked, "and where am I?" And Ray told her everything that had happened from the moment she collapsed in the garden to the strange glow, to the photo in her bag, and she listened in silence. And then said 3 words that Ray would never forget. "She's not human." Ray blinked and tried to speak, but the words would not come, and the woman continued and said her name was Lyra, and she was from another planet far from Earth, and she said she came here years ago with a small team of explorers, and her people were peaceful and curious, and they wanted to understand life across the stars, and they thought Earth would be safe, but they were wrong. Ray listened without saying a word, and Lyra said the team was captured by humans working for a secret organization that no one talks about, not even in whispers, and this group wanted alien technology and power, and when they discovered that Lyra had a child, they locked her away and studied her and the baby and tried to control them, and she had escaped only a few days ago with help from someone on the inside. "The baby is half human and half from my world," she said, "and they believe she is the bridge between 2 races, the first of her kind and maybe the last." And Ray asked why she came to him, why not keep running, and she looked into his eyes and said she didn't choose him, the baby did. Ray turned to the child, who was now awake and watching them both with calm, glowing eyes, and he asked Lyra what kind of powers the baby had, and she said they did not fully understand yet, but sometimes the baby can see memories or feel emotions, and sometimes she can make strange things happen around her, like bending light or stopping pain or waking someone from sleep without touching them. And Ray looked at the baby with new eyes, and for the first time felt not just fear but something else, something like wonder. Outside the wind picked up, and Lyra stood suddenly and said, "We have to leave now, they will come soon." And Ray asked how, and she said they have machines that can track the baby's energy, and even though she removed the chip that was inside her, there are other ways, and she begged him, "Please help us, I have no one left." And Ray thought of all the quiet days he spent alone in his house, and all the times he wondered if life had more meaning than silence and stillness. And then he nodded slowly and said, "I will help you." Lyra smiled for the first time, but it was a tired smile, and then she sat down again, her body still weak, and Ray walked to the baby and picked her up gently and said, "You are safe here, little one." And at that moment, the lights in the room flickered again, and the air felt heavy, like a storm was building far above the clouds. Lyra pulled something from her pocket, a small silver cube with a blinking blue light, and handed it to Ray and said, "If they find us, press this. It will blind their sensors for a few seconds, maybe more, and it might be our only chance to escape." And Ray nodded and slipped it into his jacket, and then there was a sound outside that made them both freeze. It was not loud, but it was steady, like boots on gravel, and voices low and sharp, and Ray peeked through the curtain and saw 2 black vehicles parked near the trees, and men in dark suits walking slowly toward the house. And he turned back to Lyra, who held the baby tightly now, and Ray whispered, "Don't speak, don't move," and he grabbed the cube from his pocket and waited by the door. Someone knocked once and then again, and a voice called out saying they were from the power company checking on sudden energy spikes in the area, and Ray stayed silent and held his breath, and the knock came again, louder this time, and Lyra's eyes were wide with fear, and the baby started to glow, and Ray whispered, "Please, not now, please stay calm," and the cube in his hand started blinking faster. Outside, the voice said, "We know she's in there, and we only want the child." And Ray stepped back, and the front light flickered one last time, and then went out completely. Ray stood frozen with the blinking cube in his hand, and the baby's soft glow filling the room like moonlight on a quiet lake, and Lyra held her breath as footsteps circled the house, slow and steady, like wolves in the dark hunting without sound. And the knock came again, but this time it was not gentle, and the voice outside was colder, saying one last time, "This is your only warning." And Ray knew they had seconds left, maybe less. He looked at Lyra and whispered, "Go through the back and take the baby, and don't stop no matter what." And she nodded and moved. Quickly her steps light but shaking with fear, and she held the baby tight against her chest and whispered something soft in her own language, and Ray turned toward the front door and pressed the cube, and it made a strange sound like wind trapped in a bottle, and the blinking blue light turned white and then disappeared into silence. There was shouting outside now, and Ray ran to the window and saw the agents grabbing their heads like something invisible had hit them, and for just a few seconds everything paused like time itself took a breath, and Ray used that moment to run out the back door and into the trees, following Lyra and the baby into the early light of morning. Ran without a path, only instinct, guiding their feet through mud and grass and twisted roots, and behind them the silence broke into noise again, with footsteps chasing and radios crackling and dogs barking in the distance, and Ray turned once and saw black figures moving between trees, and he pushed Lyra forward, telling her to keep going and not look back. They reached an old shed near the edge of the woods, something left behind by the last owner, and Ray pulled open the door and helped Lyra inside, and they closed it behind them, breathing hard and listening to the sounds outside, growing louder with each heartbeat, and the baby was calm in her arms, still glowing faintly, like she knew everything would be fine, even when everything was falling apart. Lyra looked at Ray and asked, "What now?" And he said, "We can't stay here, we need to disappear, and I know a place far from here, deep in the hills, where no signals reach and no roads lead, and it belonged to my grandfather who built it during the old days when the world was full of fear and secrets, and maybe it can protect us now." They waited until the sounds faded and the voices moved farther away, and then they slipped out and took an old forest trail that Ray remembered from childhood, and every step felt like walking deeper into the unknown, with nothing but hope and fear and the strange energy that seemed to follow the baby like a shadow. By noon, they reached an abandoned gas station where Ray had hidden an old Jeep long ago, and he cleared the dust and turned the key, and the engine coughed but started, and they drove away from the town, from the noise, from the men in black and the glowing machines, and for a few hours it felt like they were safe, but none of them believed it would last. As they drove, Lyra finally spoke and told Ray more about her world and her people, and the way they saw life not as power but as connection and balance, and how her child was born during a rare alignment of stars that only comes once in 1,000 years, and how the elders believed she was special even before the humans found them and tried to take that future away. Ray listened and asked what the child could do, and Lyra said she does not understand it all, but sometimes when the child touches someone, they feel peace or remember things long forgotten, or see things not with their eyes but with their hearts. And that is why they want her not to protect, but to use, and to turn that gift into a weapon. And Ray clenched the wheel tighter and said, "Not while I'm alive." That night they reached the hills and found the old cabin hidden behind thick trees and moss-covered stone, and it smelled of dust and time, but it felt safe and real, and they cleaned it together and lit a small fire and cooked what little food they had. And for the first time since everything began, they sat quietly and watched the baby sleep. Ray asked her name, and Lyra said she called her Solia in her language. It means light that finds its way, and Ray smiled gently and whispered, "Solia, you're safe here." And outside the wind moved through the trees like a whisper, like a promise, and they rested knowing tomorrow would bring more danger. But for now they had one night of calm, but far away in a hidden room filled with machines and silent men, a screen lit up and showed 3 heat signals moving through forest trails, and one of them glowing brighter than the sun, and a voice cold and sharp said, "We found her again. And this time don't let them run." The night was deep and quiet, with only the wind whispering through the trees and the sound of firewood crackling inside the old cabin, and Ray sat near the baby, watching her sleep as her soft glow pulsed like the rhythm of a heart that held more than blood and bone. And Lyra rested nearby, wrapped in a thick blanket, her face calm, but her hands trembling even in dreams. Ray knew peace like this would not last long, because peace in their world had a short life. He stood and stepped outside into the cold air and looked at the stars above, wondering How many secrets the sky kept hidden from those who never looked up, and he thought of everything. Lyra had told him of her world and her people, and the way they were hunted like shadows, and now he was part of it. A man with no family and no future suddenly holding the fate of something far bigger than himself. In the distance an owl called once, and then was silent, and Ray felt something shift in the air like the forest itself was warning him, and he turned and walked back inside, where Lyra was now awake, her eyes wide and alert, and she whispered to him that she felt something coming, and not just fear, but something stronger, something. Watching them from beyond the trees, Ray went to the old closet and pulled out a rusted metal box filled with old tools and wires and small traps. His grandfather once used to guard the hills from strangers, and he started working with shaking hands and focused eyes, building small alarms with wires stretched across paths and cans tied to strings so they would rattle at the slightest touch, and Lyra helped him, though her body was still weak and her eyes kept drifting to the baby as if making sure she was still real by morning. The cabin was surrounded with small defenses, and Ray taught Lyra how to use a hunting bow and how to move quietly through the forest, and she learned faster than anyone he had seen before, and he wondered if her people were always this sharp, or if motherhood had turned her into something more powerful than fear itself. They ate quietly and planned what to do next, and Lyra said they could not keep running forever, and Ray agreed, but he also knew they had no army, no backup, no help, only each other, and a child whose powers were still waking up like a storm growing under the skin of the sky. And he touched the baby's hand gently and said, "I don't know what you are, but I will not let anyone take you." Just before noon, the first alarm rang out with a sharp rattle, and Ray jumped to his feet and grabbed the binoculars and looked toward the sound and saw movement between the trees. Dark shapes moving slow and careful like hunters in a place they had studied from far away, and now wanted to touch with hands not meant for kindness. Ray told Lyra to take the baby and go to the bat cave, an old tunnel his grandfather dug long ago in case he ever needed to vanish, and she nodded and picked up Solia and kissed her forehead and whispered something in her own tongue, and then disappeared behind the bookshelf that hid the narrow entrance. And Ray turned back to the front door and waited. He saw the men clearly now, dressed in black with silver devices on their belts and masks on their faces and guns that looked more like machines from another time, and they moved in formation with no sound, no talking, no hesitation, and Ray knew they were not here to ask questions. They were here to take. One of the agents raised a hand, and the others stopped and scanned the cabin with something that blinked red and blue. And then one of them spoke into a small device and nodded, and they moved forward slowly with weapons ready, and Ray knew he had only one chance to slow them down. He pressed a button hidden under the table, and small charges went off outside, not enough to hurt, but enough to confuse, and the men fell back for a second. Ray used that moment to shoot a flare into the sky, not to signal help, but to blind the sensors they were using, and for a few seconds the world outside became bright as fire and white as sun, and Ray ran through the tunnel entrance and closed the bookshelf. Behind him he ran through the narrow space, his breath loud in the silence, and caught up to Lyra, who was waiting at the end of the tunnel, and together they slipped into the deeper part of the forest, where the trees grew taller and older than memory, and the light barely touched the ground, and the path ahead was unknown behind. Then the agents entered the empty cabin and found nothing but heat and ash, and one of them looked at the old photo left on the table and saw 3 faces looking back with something stronger than fear, something like hope, and he crushed it in his hand and said, "They won't get far." But far ahead through trees and silence, Ray held Solia close and said, "We will get through this." And Lyra walked beside him, not as a stranger now, but as something stronger, like family made by fire and choice. And the child between them opened her eyes and for the first time smiled. The forest whispered around them with wind weaving between the trees, and the sky above hidden by branches that seemed to stretch forever, and Ray walked with steady feet, carrying Solia in his arms, while Lyra followed close behind her, steps slow But sure, her eyes sharp and watchful, and every shadow felt like a warning, every bird cry like an alarm, and still. They kept moving deeper into the wild where maps ended and memories faded. They reached a clearing by evening where the old bunker stood like a ghost from another age, its door half buried in Durhan moss and vines, wrapped around rusted hinges, and Ray dropped to his knees and cleared the entrance with his hands, until the shape of a steel handle appeared, and with one long pull the door creaked open, revealing cold darkness and stale air, and they stepped inside with only the light from Solia's glow guiding their way through metal halls and quiet dust inside. The walls were lined with shelves covered in old tools and wires and war manuals from a time when fear came from missiles and borders, not stars and sky. And Ray remembered stories from his grandfather about this place and how it was built not just to hide, but to fight back if the world ever turned into something unrecognizable and dangerous. And now that world was real and standing at his door. Lyra placed Solia in a small cot, wrapped her gently, and began preparing food with what they had left, while Ray explored the bunker, opening drawers and crates and pulling out equipment untouched for years, and each piece he touched felt like a promise not to run anymore, not to hide forever, but to stand and protect and defend what mattered, even if the odds were shadows and silence. He found an old generator and rewired it with care, connecting it to ancient lights that flickered once then again, and finally held steady, and the bunker came to life around them like a sleeping beast waking from a long dream. And Lyra turned to with a look of tired wonder, as if she too felt the shift in the air, the weight of resistance being born again. They trained in that bunker during the days that followed, Lyra learning to aim and move and signal, and Ray teaching her how to listen, how to track, how to think like someone who never gives up. And Solia watched them with eyes full of quiet fire, and every so often she would reach out and touch something and make it work without wires, without batteries, just with will. And Ray saw it not as magic, but as something even older, something like life speaking through her. They set traps in the forest, wires and smoke bombs and motion alarms, and they mapped every path and every clearing and created signals with lights and mirrors, and they learned to move like the wind and hide like mist. And each night they returned to the bunker and whispered stories to Solia about stars and rivers and peace. But far away the enemy moved with purpose and silence, tracking energy spikes and listening to airwaves, and they had not forgotten the child or the man or the woman who stole what they believed was theirs. And in a room filled with screens and machines, a figure in a dark suit said one command: prepare the retrieval and no errors this time. One afternoon the skies above the forest grew darker, not from clouds but from something unnatural, something mechanical and cold, and Ray looked up and knew it had begun, and he grabbed his gear and turned to Lyra, who nodded without a word, and they took positions across the field near the old bunker and waited. First drone came fast and silent, hovering above the trees, scanning heat and sound, and Ray triggered a pulse device that fried its circuits and sent it crashing down in flames. And the sound echoed across the hills like a war drum, and more drones followed, and behind them came the soldiers, black suits, silver masks, eyes hidden in hearts. Hollow Ray fired his first shot, not to kill, but to stall, to warn, and the traps exploded in flashes and smoke and fire, and the forest turned into a maze of noise and confusion. And through it all Lyra moved like light and shadow, fast and precise, leading soldiers away from the bunker and toward dead ends where ground collapsed and wires snapped and fear began to crack their perfect march inside the bunker. Solia sat quietly, but her glow grew brighter and her small hands shook, and the machines near her began to hum, and Ray returned just in time to see it, and he fell to his knees and whispered to her, "Not yet, not now," and she looked at him with ancient eyes and spoke for the first time in a voice soft as wind, but strong as stone. "No more running." And in that moment, the lights in the bunker turned blue and the walls shimmered like water, and every system came online, and a signal burst from the antenna above, reaching across frequencies, known and unknown, and in far places. Other watchers lifted their heads and listened. Ray looked at Lyra, and saw fire in her eyes and strength in her stance, and he felt something rise inside him, something human and unbreakable and full of fight, and he turned to the door and said, "If they want her, they will have to face us together." The trees outside the bunker stood still as if holding their breath, and inside the air felt different, heavier, charged with something unseen and ancient. And Solia sat in the center of the room, her glow now steady and warm, while Ray stood at the door, gripping the old rifle in his hands with Lyra beside him, her face calm, but her eyes fierce, like someone who had already lost everything once and would not lose again. Alarms they had built had all gone quiet, too quiet, and Ray knew silence like this was not peace, it was the calm before a wave. The kind of quiet that carries shadows and questions, and he stepped out into the trees to scout ahead with Lyra watching his back, and the forest around them felt darker than before, as if it too sensed something new entering its roots and branches. They moved slowly, following broken twigs and footprints half buried in mud, and found the remains of a drone torn apart not by traps or fire, but something else. Something that left no trace except for melted metal and strange marks on the ground, like symbols burned into earth by hands not made for this world. Knelt beside the marks and touched the soil, and it felt cold like ice under sunlight. And he looked at Lyra, who stared at the sky and whispered that they are not just sending soldiers anymore. And Ray asked who, and she said the ones behind the curtain. The real ones, the ones who never show their faces. They returned to the bunker with caution and sealed the door, and watched the monitors and saw something moving through the forest. Something tall and thin and faster than any man, and it did not walk, it glided like smoke, with limbs that moved without bending and eyes that flickered like lightning. Trapped in glass, Ray knew in his bones that this was not human and not just a machine, and Lyra confirmed it with a name spoken in a low voice. The Cathari, a species older than memory, hunters of blood and light, who do not take prisoners, who do not speak, who do not sleep, and who had once destroyed an entire star system to capture one child with a gift like Solia shed. The Cathari had no leaders, only commands, and their mission was simple: find control, use. And Ray looked at Solia, who now stared at the screen where the figure was moving closer, and her expression had changed. She no longer looked like a child, but like something more aware, more connected, like a storm waiting behind gentle eyes. Ray turned on the defense grid, a system he barely understood but hoped would work, and blue light shimmered across the ceiling and the walls hummed with power, and Lyra checked her weapon and whispered to Solia that they would protect her no matter what, no matter who came. And Ray placed his hand on the child's shoulder, and she nodded once without fear. When the Cathari reached the edge of the field, it stopped and tilted its head, as if listening to something beyond sound. And then it raised its arm, and a ripple passed through the trees, and everything bent slightly, as if the world itself took a step back. And then it moved forward into the light, and alarms screamed, and the sky above the bunker turned red. Ray fired first, but the bullets passed through the creature like wind through water, and Lyra launched a flare that exploded above the trees and confused its sensors for just a breath, and Ray shouted for her to fall back, and they retreated into the bunker, where Solia now stood on her feet, glowing brighter than ever before. Cathari entered the outer room, and every metal surface twisted at its presence, and screens cracked and wires sparked, and Ray grabbed the cube from before the one that blocked signals and threw it at the creature, and the light burst like a star, and for one moment the Cathari froze, and Solia stepped forward. Without fear she raised her hand, and the walls stopped shaking, and the air grew still, and she looked into the eyes of the creature, and it stopped moving completely, like something caught in time. And Lyra whispered, "What is she doing?" And Ray said, "I think she is showing it something." On the screen they saw visions flicker, memories not from Earth, but from the stars, children playing under blue moons, rivers that floated through the sky, families laughing without sound, all seen through the Cathari's eyes. And then Solia showed it Earth, the trees, the fire, the fear, the love, and something inside the creature changed, not broken, not destroyed, just shifted like a shadow, learning what it means to have light. The Cathari stepped back slowly and turned without a word and disappeared into the forest, and Ray fell to his knees and breathed for the first time in what felt like hours, and Lyra held Solia and cried silent tears and whispered thank you again and again. But far above the clouds a ship opened its eyes and watched and calculated and prepared, and a voice, not human, not machine, said the child has awakened and the next phase must begin, and a second voice replied, then send. The others. Ray looked at the stars that night and knew the real war had not started yet, and still he whispered to the wind, we are ready. The morning came slow and silent with soft light, pouring through the trees and touching the edge of the old bunker, and inside Ray stood by the window watching shadows stretch across the ground while Lyra prepared food quietly and Solia sat in the corner, her glow calm now like a small sun resting after a long journey. Ray had not slept and the weight on his shoulders felt heavier than before, not because of fear but because of the truth he now carried, and he thought about the Cathari and the vision Solia had shared, and how something that terrifying could still choose to walk away, and that meant something powerful, something worth protecting. Lyra placed a hand on Ray's shoulder and asked if he was ready, and he nodded even though he was. Not because readiness was no longer a feeling, it was a choice. And today he had made that choice, not for war, not for glory, but for one child who did not ask to be a weapon, who only wanted to live. They knew the sky would not stay quiet, because the ship above the clouds had already sent a signal, and others were coming, not Cathari this time, but machines made by minds that had forgotten how to feel, machines built for only one purpose, to retrieve and erase. And they would not stop, they would not think. They would only follow orders. Ray walked to the center of the room and opened the last case his grandfather had hidden, one marked with an old symbol, and inside were blueprints, tools, energy packs, and a vest lined with armor and strange circuits. And Ray touched each item with steady hands, as if connecting to the spirit of someone who had once prepared for this moment, even if he never lived to see it. Lyra helped him put on the vest and placed the final device on his back, a shield generator modified by alien parts and human hands, and powered by Solia's light, and it hummed with quiet strength, wrapped Ray in a field of invisible protection that pulsed with each beat of his heart. And he looked at himself in the mirror and did not see a soldier, he saw a guardian. They stepped outside together, Ray, Lyra, and Solia, who now walked between them, her steps small but sure, her hands glowing gently with a warmth that made the wind still and the birds pause, and the earth seemed to lean in and listen, and the forest that once whispered in fear now whispered in hope. The sound came first, not loud, but sharp like metal splitting air, and then the ship appeared above the trees, black and wide with light scanning the ground. And when it opened its lower hatch, the machines began to fall, not dropped, but placed with cold precision, and they landed on their feet and stood in silence waiting for the command to move. Ray looked at Solia and then at Lyra, and then stepped forward holding a signal booster in his hand, one last trick he had built from scraps and memory, and he raised it high and pressed the button, and every machine paused for just one breath, and in that breath Ray ran forward, drawing fire and leading them away from the clearing, away from the bunker, away from the child. Shield around him flared bright as the first blast hit, and he felt the force push him back, but he stayed on his feet and kept moving through trees and fire and light. And behind him the machines followed, firing without pause, and Lyra used the moment to carry Solia into the hills where an escape pod waited, hidden under roots and stone, powered by old tech and new hope. Ray reached the edge of a cliff where the old river ran deep below and turned to face the machines, who now surrounded him, and he raised his arms and shouted that they would not take her, that they would never take her, and the machines responded by charging together like a wave of metal. And Ray closed his eyes and activated the core of the shield, and everything exploded in blue light. The blast echoed for miles, and birds scattered and trees bent, and machines fell one by one, their circuits fried by the pulse of energy that came not just from tech, but from a promise, a bond stronger than metal, stronger than fear, stronger than death. Lyra turned as the light faded and saw only silence and smoke, and Solia held her hand tighter and whispered something. Soft, something that sounded like goodbye, and her glow flickered once, then faded, and then returned brighter than before. They launched the pod into the sky, and it disappeared into the clouds, carrying Lyra and Solia far away to a place Ray had marked on old maps, a place without signals, without eyes, without war. And as the ship vanished, the forest stood still again, as if honoring what had just passed. Many days later, in a room far away from war, Solia sat beside Lyra and painted stars on the wall, and when asked who taught her, she said, "A man who gave everything, not because he had to, but because he chose to, because when she needed someone, he stood up and became her shield." And across the stars, the story of the man and the light. And the choice began to spread, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a seed planted in silence, a reminder that even in the face of machines and monsters, humanity still stands.